The Genius of Their Age. Ibn Sina, Biruni, and the Lost Enlightenment. Frederick Starr. Introduction. The introduction of the book introduces Ibn Sina and Biruni as two of the most outstanding thinkers between ancient Greece and the European Renaissance. The book aims to bring these two figures to the attention of the general public, as they are relatively unknown outside of specialist circles. Their obscurity may be partly because they were born in Central Asia, a region often perceived as remote and troubled. However, Central Asia was a crossroads in trade routes, linking Europe and the Middle East with India and China. Ibn Sina is credited with creating a comprehensive intellectual framework encompassing philosophy, science, medicine, and religion. He reconfigured Aristotle's synthesis of knowledge and is considered a founder of scholastic philosophy. His contributions to geology, mathematics, and especially medicine are also highlighted. Ibn Sina's canon of medicine is described as a summary of all known medical knowledge, structured logically and accessibly, focusing on neurological questions, brain function, and environmental and psychiatric conditions for health. It is also noted for its precise rules for clinical trials of new medicines. The canon of medicine is considered a foundational work in medical education and practice for 6 centuries across the Middle East, Europe, and parts of India. The book will explore the lives of Ibn Sina and Biruni, placing their writings in the context of their times, using a parallel lives approach inspired by Plutarch. The book will not detail everything they wrote about in fields such as mathematics, philosophy, or medicine, but will focus on their lives and the context of their writings. The author acknowledges the work of specialists in the field, while also noting the tendency of specialized studies to use biographical information as a garnish rather than the main focus. 1. Together and Apart. The chapter Together and Apart introduces the setting where Ibn Sina and Biruni's paths crossed, and notes the differences in their status and temperaments. The story begins in Khwarazm, an ancient Central Asian region located near the border of present-day Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan, about 100 kilometers, 60 miles, south of the Aral Sea. This location was remote from major centers of the time, including Damascus, Constantinople, Baghdad, and the ancient Indian centers of Lahore and Delhi. Despite being products of the same Central Asian culture and part of a small, highly educated elite, Ibn Sina and Biruni were fundamentally different. They were lifelong competitors and rivals, having sparred ferociously in their 20s and avoiding each other by their 30s. Ibn Sina was a courtier and bon vivant, aspiring to organize all knowledge under a single umbrella, while Biruni was more of a loner who toiled alone, focusing on specific observations before generalizing. In terms of status, Biruni, as a royal appointee, outranked Ibn Sina, who was employed by the minister Suhaili. However, Ibn Sina was already famous for his medical expertise and philosophical writings. The difference in their rank would likely have affected their seating arrangements at court, but not their daily lives. Although both men interacted with other intellectuals at the Gurganj court, there's no evidence that they were close. The lack of evidence of direct interaction between Ibn Sina and Biruni suggests that they viewed each other as competitors, rivals, or even enemies. They both received instruction in Aristotelian philosophy, but differed in their approaches to it. Ibn Sina was influenced by Ismaili missionaries, which led him to explore faith, God's role in human affairs, and the validity of assertions. Biruni, under the tutelage of Ibn Iraq, focused on mathematics, geometry, geography, and astronomy. Biruni was fascinated by the concrete realities of the world, learning about plants, Christianity, and foreign languages from merchants and traders, opening a window to customs and beliefs throughout the known world. He was also influenced by the work of Khwarazmi, whose algebra was revolutionary. Both completed their basic training by age 17 and benefited from a privileged upbringing, allowing them to pursue creative work. They depended on wealthy individuals for patronage, which was often short-lived. 2. Privileged Prodigies. The chapter, Privileged Prodigies, details the early lives and education of Ibn Sina and Biruni, highlighting the influences that shaped their intellectual development. Ibn Sina grew up in the family of an ambitious, upwardly mobile, and cultivated senior civil servant. His father was a governor under the Samanids and was sympathetic to Ismaili missionaries. His home was a place where philosophical and religious questions were discussed, exposing Ibn Sina to different viewpoints from a young age. Ibn Sina's early education was rigorous, starting with the study of the Quran, followed by logic, jurisprudence, and mathematics. His father brought in a tutor, Abu Abdullah al-Natili, a medical expert and philosopher, to teach his sons. Ibn Sina, however, developed a lasting contempt for Natili, though he still drew heavily on Natili's work. Ibn Sina was also apprenticed to a merchant, which exposed him to Indian numbers, what are incorrectly called Arabic numerals, and Indian mathematics. He also studied medicine with passion, gaining access to a wide array of ancient and modern medical texts, including those by Galen. Ibn Sina began treating patients by age 16 and was so successful that he was consulted by the ruler of Bokhara. This success gave him access to the royal library, the storehouse of wisdom, which served as a kind of university for him. Biruni was an orphan who had no knowledge of his father. His name, meaning someone from the suburbs, suggests he was not from the city of Kath. He became the ward of the brother-in-law of the last ruler of Khwarazm, Ibn Iraq. Ibn Iraq, a distinguished mathematician and astronomer, became Biruni's stepfather, teacher, and patron, sharing his passion for learning with his young ward. Biruni followed in Ibn Iraq's footsteps, particularly in mathematics and astronomy. Aristotle's philosophy was a major influence on both men. Philosophy at the time encompassed all knowledge, including physics, ethics, astronomy, botany, and psychology. Aristotle's works challenged them to explore all fields of knowledge and integrate them into a single system of thought. Both Ibn Sina and Biruni were deeply engaged with Aristotle's writings, which they sought to master, revise, or transcend. Ibn Sina was particularly interested in dialectics, the process of arriving at truth through rigorous debate. Biruni sought to test propositions advanced by the ancient Greeks, correcting or rejecting them when necessary. Biruni's interest in mathematics and astronomy was also influenced by a tradition in Khwarazm and Central Asia, where a pagan ruler had used logarithmic spirals in palace decorations, and the city of Merv was known for its renowned observatory. Ibn Iraq was one of the co-discoverers of the law relating the sides of a spherical triangle to the sines of the opposite angles, an issue that also engaged Biruni. Both men benefited from a privileged upbringing amid security, allowing them to plunge into creative work and take advantage of whatever opportunities they were offered. They were also both open to wealthy individuals who would approach them with questions and offer rewards, leading them to depend on individual patronage. Both were influenced by the translations of Greek texts made available in the Muslim East. This influx of knowledge sparked a boom in medical research and writing. 3. Promise and Disruption. The chapter, Promise and Disruption, describes how Ibn Sina and Biruni's early lives of privilege and intellectual freedom were disrupted by the political instability of the time. By the age of 17, both Ibn Sina and Biruni had completed their basic training and apprenticeships and had shown exceptional talents, while benefiting from a privileged upbringing that allowed them security and the freedom to pursue their intellectual interests. Neither of them had a need to seek regular employment. They were open to wealthy patrons who would commission them with a question and offer generous rewards for the answer. This meant that both men depended on individual patronage, which was often short in duration. Ibn Sina was commissioned by a neighbor, Abu Bakr al-Baraki, to comment on the main issues in philosophy and Quranic exegesis, and on practical ethics. This led to a lengthy study of Aristotle's logic, where Ibn Sina explored issues of consciousness and the soul, and a separate essay entitled Piety and Sin. Both works are now lost. In these works, Ibn Sina used logic to demonstrate how divine punishments on corrupt cities and tyrants were derived from first principles, from God. Biruni, meanwhile, continued his exploration of astronomy, mathematics, and geography under the tutelage of Ibn Iraq. None of Biruni's writing from this early period survives. However, a note he wrote later in life about having damaged his eyesight while observing a solar eclipse allowed a Russian scholar to determine that Biruni had used a simple instrument of his own design to gauge the height of the sun at the equinoxes. Using this instrument, Biruni also estimated the obliquity of the ecliptic at the equator, with results that closely approximated those achieved by Simon Newcomb in the 19th century. By their early 20s, it was clear that Ibn Sina and Biruni had evolved in quite different directions. Ibn Sina was attracted to the eternal questions of faith and reason. His early patrons shared this concern with the eternal questions of faith and reason. Biruni grew up under the influence of his mentor, Ibn Iraq, and became his co-researcher, focusing on mathematics, astronomy, and their practical applications. Biruni's later career was a continuation of Ibn Iraq's labors. Ibn Sina claimed to have rejected the rationalistic and mystical teachings of the Ismaili missionaries, but was nonetheless attracted to the questions they raised. The period of comfort, security, and intellectual freedom they had enjoyed during their first 2 decades ended abruptly, and they were to spend the next half-century amid unceasing turmoil and strife. 4. Caught in the Whirlwind. The chapter, Caught in the Whirlwind, details the major turning point in the lives of Ibn Sina and Biruni, which occurred between 992 and 995, when they were in their early 20s. This period was marked by the collapse of the Samani dynasty, under whose rule they had been born and shaped. For Biruni, this crisis was unexpected, sudden, and crushing, leading him to recall that disaster took me by surprise, erasing all that I had known and all the fruits of my endeavors. The Samani's rule was undermined by several factors: the rise of the Karakhanids, secessionist movements in Khwarezm and Khorasan, pressure from the Buyids. The last 3 Samani rulers in Bokhara vacillated between inaction and risky adventurism. The Samanis granted near unlimited power to a young Turkic general named Sebuktigin, further destabilizing the situation. The Buyids, who controlled territories to the west of the Samanis, threatened to shift their loyalties if taxes were not lowered, which contributed to a spirit of secessionism. Biruni was forced to flee from Kath, leaving behind his books, instruments, and globe, which were destroyed during the rebellion. He traveled to Ray, the seat of the Shiite Buyids, arriving penniless and without friends. He was given lodging by a merchant. He had to endure insults from a well-to-do ignoramus. He spent 2 years in Ray, during which time he was inspired by jewelers to study minerals, leading him to invent the concept of specific gravity. He also began compiling a catalogue of the writings of the medical pioneer Abu Bakr al-Razi. Biruni worked under the tutelage of the mathematician and astronomer Abu Mahmud Khujandi, who was working on the obliquity of the ecliptic at the time. Khujandi had also discovered that the obliquity of the ecliptic was changing through time. Ibn Sina also faced upheaval when the Karakhanid leader Bughra Khan attacked Bokhara in 992. The Samani emir's attempt to mount a defense failed. The emir barely escaped before Bughra Khan's army took the city. Despite these challenges, the turmoil confirmed rather than undermined Ibn Sina and Biruni's commitment to their studies. For Biruni, this meant focusing on mathematics and astronomy and their practical application. For Ibn Sina, it meant medicine and the rational processes for understanding everything from nature to God. Ibn Sina continued his medical studies and wrote his first philosophical treatises, while working in an office job. Biruni lived as a pauper in order to work with Khujandi. Both men gained recognition and admiration among the intellectual community of Central Asia and the Muslim East. By the time of Biruni's arrival, Ray was a leading trading center with rich libraries and was home to a Syrian Christian bishopric, as well as Zoroastrians, and also had been the birthplace of Abu Bakr al-Razi. The ruler of Ray, Fachar al-Dawla, had attracted the mathematician and astronomer Abu Mahmud Khajondi to his court. Ray was descending into chaos, as Fachar al-Dawla spent his time fighting his brothers. Fachar al-Dawla's attempt to seize Samani's lands led to unrest in Ray, and both his vizier and Fachar himself died in 997. By 997, Biruni had returned to his hometown. Mamun ibn Muhammad destroyed the Ibn Iraq dynasty and moved the capital to Gurganj, inviting Ibn Iraq to his court. 5. Arguing Aristotle. The chapter, Arguing Aristotle, details the intellectual exchange between Biruni and Ibn Sina, focusing on their differing interpretations of Aristotle's works, particularly his astronomical ideas. Biruni initiated the exchange by sending a letter directly to Ibn Sina with 10 pointed questions, all concerning the interpretation of Aristotle's on the heavens. Biruni questioned why Aristotle denied the existence of gravity and vacuums in space. Biruni asserted that gravity works everywhere, pulling everything toward the center of the Earth unless a countervailing force prevented it. He also argued for the existence of an extraterrestrial vacuum. Biruni questioned Aristotle's denial of absolute weight and asked why the heavens appeared to be moving westward in a circular motion if there was no gravity. Ibn Sina responded using syllogistic logic, asserting that every astronomical body has a natural position and that the fixed stars could not be light or heavy. He then sought to reinforce his argument by distinguishing between actuality and potentiality. Biruni dismissed this response as arguing for the sake of arguing. Ibn Sina also disagreed with Biruni's claim that the stars and planets appear to be moving in opposite directions, which he felt violated Aristotle's principle that all movement in the heavens had to be strictly circular. Ibn Sina questioned Biruni's belief in the eternity of the universe, accusing him of drawing his ideas from the religious skeptic Razi and criticizing Razi's competence in metaphysics. Biruni questioned Aristotle's atomism and Ibn Sina's objection to it. Biruni found Aristotle's argument for atomism weak, and even less acceptable were the arguments against atomism, including Ibn Sina's argument that anything occupying space could be divided. Biruni asked Ibn Sina how to resolve the standoff between the atomists and their critics. Ibn Sina invoked the Aristotelian distinction between what is potentially so and what is actually so, implying that while atomism was theoretically possible, it was impossible in reality. Biruni saw this as splitting hairs. Biruni challenged Aristotle's claim that the universe must be spherical due to the economy of space, arguing that mathematics equally supported an elliptical or oval pattern of heavenly motion, anticipating Johannes Kepler's view on the elliptical shape of Mars' orbit. Ibn Sina accepted Biruni's questioning of Aristotle, but objected to the idea of a vacuum in space that this implied, challenging Biruni to produce mathematical support. Ibn Sina defended Aristotle's views that planets moved from east to west, and that their movement generated heat, invoking the authority of ancient thinkers, such as Heraclitus, Thales, Diogenes, and Anaximander. Ibn Sina grew increasingly frustrated with Biruni's relentless questioning of Aristotle, which threatened his worldview. Biruni questioned the nature of heat, how it reaches us from the sun, and the transformation of water into air through boiling. Biruni called out Ibn Sina for not having read several major works by John of Philoponus, who had broken with Aristotle's doctrines. Biruni charged that it was Aristotle himself who deserved the epithet mischievous for arguing that the universe was eternal but evading the question of a creator. The exchange became increasingly hostile, though it's important to note that only Ibn Sina's version of events is preserved. It seems that Biruni's initial questions were sincere, while Ibn Sina's replies were initially serious, but grew increasingly haughty. Biruni criticized Ibn Sina's logic, and Ibn Sina responded by having his student and assistant, Abu Said Ahmad al-Masumi, draft responses to Biruni's further questions, suggesting that Ibn Sina was avoiding direct engagement. Biruni's further questions related to physics, such as why a spherical glass vessel acts as a magnifying or burning glass when filled with water but not when empty, the effect of gravity on different substances, the reason water appears opaque from some angles, the creation of a vacuum by an inverted glass in water, and why a bottle breaks when water inside it freezes. He also questioned Aristotle's geography by asking why Aristotle claimed half of the northern hemisphere and all of the southern hemisphere were uninhabited when conditions were similar. Masumi, on behalf of Ibn Sina, defended the views of Aristotle's early Greek followers, the Peripatetics, quoting Aristotle's own words as defense against Biruni's criticism. Biruni and Ibn Sina only agreed on the issue of otomists. Ibn Sina viewed himself as an ardent student of Aristotle, while Biruni was a critic of Aristotle's conclusions and method, but still acknowledged his debt to Aristotle. Biruni emerged as a sharp critic of Aristotle and a harbinger of modernity. Later, Biruni defended the ancient Greeks against modern critics, reminding his readers that Aristotle was a theoretician, not a theologian. However, Biruni was not a worshipper of the ancients and rebuked Ptolemy for his numerous errors, and also rebuked those who use frivolous logic to answer fundamental questions. Biruni insisted that valid conclusions must be based on careful measurement and mathematics. Biruni's critique of Aristotle anticipated the scientific revolution. Biruni also attacked the use of syllogisms to grasp the concept of time, arguing that such core issues cannot be realized by mind's reasoning only by syllogism, and instead, careful measurement and mathematics are required. Biruni's challenges to Aristotle and his champion, Ibn Sina, highlighted their fundamental differences in approaching knowledge and truth. 6. Inventing a World History. The chapter, Inventing a World History, focuses on Biruni's groundbreaking work, the chronology of ancient nations, and his development of a universal timeline. Biruni was commissioned by Emir Qaboos to create a single system of time measurement for the court, encompassing various cultures and their historical records. Qaboos asked Biruni to explain the eras used by different nations, as well as the differences in their months and years. Biruni's chronology is a complex work that delves into calendars and historical systems from various cultures, including Egyptians, Persians, Greeks, Romans, Muslims, Christians, and Jews. He also included information on less well-known peoples and sects from Central Asia. Biruni sought to understand how different cultures measured time and constructed history, and then to create a system for converting dates from one system to another. He aimed to create a single timeline to place events from all over the world, which he considered essential for global interaction and understanding. Prior to Biruni, each culture used its own calendar with its own starting point for historical time, such as the creation, Adam and Eve, or the biblical flood. Even when acknowledging a common starting point, such as the birth of Alexander the Great, they differed about when that event occurred. Ancient historians like Herodotus and Polybius had explored diverse cultures, but did not attempt to integrate their concepts of time. Herodotus, while curious about foreign peoples, wrote for a Greek audience and viewed time through the Greek calendar. Polybius used the 4-year units of the Olympiads, which was only understandable to Romans and Greeks. Biruni's approach was unique in its pluralism. He assumed that all cultures were equal. He interviewed heretics, presented religions without polemics, and sought to identify the core beliefs of each faith. He practiced cultural anthropology centuries before it emerged as a scientific discipline. Biruni determined that a scientific approach was needed to evaluate the various systems of time. He used the precise duration of a day, month, and year as measured by astronomy. He recalculated important dates using his new, autonomous, and all-encompassing measure. Biruni noted that errors in measuring a day led to the creation of months and years of differing durations, which caused confusion. He was critical of the way different peoples dated the beginning of historic time, deeming them mixed with falsification and myths. He was also critical of those who did not understand that the most precise way to measure a day was when the sun is at the meridian. He criticized the Arabs, Jews, and Christians for their systems of time, as well as for their various dates for Adam and Eve and the biblical flood. He lambasted writers who made inconceivable suppositions and did not base their decisions on reason. He did praise the Greeks for their knowledge of geometry and astronomy and for adhering strictly to logical arguments. Biruni understood that a common system of time was essential for commerce and interactions among different peoples. He identified the length of an astronomical year as 365 days and 6 hours long, and that failure to account for that extra quarter of a day caused dates for feasts and holidays to migrate throughout the year. He noted that the pre-Muslim Arabs had fixed their month of fasting, but the Muslims' month of Ramadan moved, and continues to move, throughout the year. He proposed the use of intercalation, leap year, to correct such errors, calling it a litmus test by which he measured the intellectual seriousness of all cultures. He praised the Egyptians, Greeks, Chaldeans, and Syrians for the precision of their intercalations, while being less generous toward the Jews and Nestorian Christians. Biruni created a chessboard schema for converting dates from one system to another using a large circular graph or chart. It showed the eras, dates, and intervals according to each culture. He claimed his invention would be useful to both historians and astronomers. The original copies of Biruni's chronology and his chessboard likely remained with Cabus, and it did not gain wide dissemination in the Islamic world. The book remained untranslated until 1879, when a German scholar found a manuscript and translated it. Biruni's work effectively created the first global system for measuring time, as well as the first global calendar system, and was the missing key for constructing an integrated world history. His work applied Pythagoras's maxim that things are numbers. By grounding his concept of history on mathematics and astronomy, he was offering a single global calendar. Cabus supported Biruni's research by giving him the resources he needed, but he was also a brutal ruler. After the chronology, Biruni returned to earlier projects, carrying out detailed astronomical studies and also defending Al-Khwarizmi against criticism. The chronology's mix of cultural history, religion, and technical astronomy, as well as its great length, may have made it inaccessible to many readers. 7. From Peace to Chaos. The chapter, From Peace to Chaos, details the period of relative stability in Gurganj where both Biruni and Ibn Sina were present, followed by the political turmoil that led to their departure. Biruni returned to Gurganj in the winter of 1003 and immediately resumed his research, studying a lunar eclipse. Around 1004 or 1005, Ibn Sina arrived in Gurganj, and for the next 7 years he and Biruni were in the same city, serving the same government and attending the same court, though their correspondence suggests they were not close. During this period, Gurganj became the intellectual epicenter of Central Asia and the Muslim East. The young Shah, Abu al-Abbas Mamun, supported this cultural flourishing but was also self-indulgent and indecisive. A significant event during this time was the departure of Suhaili, the vizier, for Baghdad in 1013. This caused panic because many, including Ibn Sina, owed their positions to Suhaili. Ibn Sina sensed that his time in Gurganj was coming to an end even before his patron decamped. A two-front crisis was brewing in Khwarazm. The Samanis had granted overlordship of Khwarazm to Sebuktigin and his son Mahmud. The Shah's generals and landlords opposed Mahmud and expanded their forces, fearing the Shah would give in to Mahmud. Biruni served as vizier to the Shah and attempted to appease the rebellious generals while preventing conflict with Mahmud. Biruni sent an ambassador to Mahmud, but this only revealed to Mahmud the extent of the revolt. Mahmud offered to assure peace if the Friday sermon in every mosque acknowledged him as the ultimate sovereign. This demand, though merely confirming Mahmud's existing control, inflamed the generals and landlords. The Shah, possibly at Biruni's urging, attempted to bribe the generals with silver. This only further angered the rebels. Biruni tried to buy time by having the Sultan claim the Kotba was just to test the generals. Biruni also proposed negotiating with independent Turkic nomads to use their forces against the dissidents. The Shah's dissident generals launched an armed assault on Gurganj and murdered Shah Abu al-Abbas Mamun. Mamun's murder gave Mahmud a pretext to intervene. Mahmud's army included 100,000 horses and 500 war elephants, while the defenders at Gurganj could only muster 50,000 fighters. Mahmud's army marched into Gurganj, rounded up the rebels, and wreaked terrible vengeance. Ringleaders were trampled to death by elephants, and their bodies were dismembered. The rest of the rebels faced extreme cruelty. These events led to the end of the era of peace in Gurganj and resulted in significant changes in the region, uprooting old dynasties. The events also led to Ibn Sina's flight to Gorgan and Biruni's trek to Afghanistan. 8. Nemesis. Mahmud of Ghazni. The chapter Nemesis. Mahmud of Ghazni focuses on Mahmud of Ghazni's rise to power and his impact on the lives of Biruni and Ibn Sina. It highlights how Mahmud's actions reshaped the political and cultural landscape of Central Asia, and how he became a central figure in the lives of these two thinkers. Mahmud's rise was a turning point that brought an end to existing dynasties and elevated a new ruling class with different cultural and ethnic backgrounds. This shift disrupted established patronage systems for artists, musicians, poets, and scientists. The political conditions in Central Asia had been deteriorating, but with Mahmud's assassination and Mahmud's conquest of Khwarezm, the situation reached a critical point. These events uprooted ancient dynasties and led to a new ruling class that was ethnically and culturally distinct from their predecessors. Mahmud of Ghazni became the dominant force who shaped the conditions under which Biruni and Ibn Sina worked for the rest of their lives. He both closed some opportunities and opened others for them, essentially directing the course of their careers. Mahmud directed an all-encompassing wave of change, a geopolitical tsunami that caused bloody conflicts, the rise and fall of empires, and bitter religious strife until his death in 1030. Mahmud was of short or middle height with a face scarred by smallpox, but he established a vast empire spanning Central Asia, the Middle East, and parts of India. The city of Ghazni, located southwest of Kabul in Afghanistan, was the center of Mahmud's dynasty. Much of what is known about Mahmud's life is from the writings of Bayhaqi, a civil servant in Ghazni's correspondence department. Bayhaqi documented Mahmud's reign and that of his son Masud, though much of his work has been lost. Mahmud's father, Sebuktigin, had been a slave who rose to become a general for the Samonis and was rewarded with the territory of Ghazni. When local Hindu princes seized his Afghan domains, he recaptured Ghazni and expanded his control westward toward Khorasan. Despite favoring Mahmud, Sebuktigin inexplicably left control of his capital to a younger son. Mahmud seized control of Ghazni by defeating his own brother in 998. Mahmud consolidated his power by cutting a deal with the Karakhanids and focusing on Khorasan and India. Khorasan was important for trade routes and its wealth, while India was a source of riches, slaves, and war elephants. Mahmud's army was enormous, with over 100,000 men for major battles. The army was the state, and society was organized to meet its needs, focusing on the manufacture of war tools. The army consisted primarily of Turkic slaves, as well as captives and local men lured by promises of wealth. Many soldiers were refugees hoping to share in the plunder. Mahmud launched 26 expeditions into India in search of plunder, resulting in a huge transfer of wealth. After each campaign, captives were brought to Ghazni as slaves. One campaign in Sindh and Punjab produced 45,000 captives, with some going into the army and others into the slave market. Mahmud's army was ethnically diverse, including Afghans, Turks, Indians, Kurds, Persians, and Arabs. To maintain control, Mahmud created a department of secret intelligence, a spy agency monitoring both domestic and foreign affairs. Mahmud was outwardly pious, fulfilling his religious duties and reading the Quran daily. He justified his campaigns as spreading the faith, and he opposed religious dissenters. His government shifted from the Hanafi to the Shafi school of Islamic law. Mahmud sought legitimacy from the caliphate in Baghdad, declaring himself the caliph's servant. The caliph recognized Mahmud as the regional hegemon, and Mahmud's campaigns of plunder were rebranded as wars of Islam against infidels. Mahmud was given religious titles by the caliph, including Avenger of the Faith, and issued coins proclaiming his glory and that of the caliph. Mahmud desecrated the Hindu temple at Somnath and installed its holy lingam stone under the entrance of his mosque in Ghazni. Mahmud was described as self-willed and impatient, but also as physically brave and merciful to some foes. He was attentive to the education of his sons and responsive to complaints. He was also considered a great patron of culture, maintaining 400 poets in his court. He also supported artists and writers, and was a builder in the grand style. Mahmud favored Persian over his ancestral Turkic tongue, and he also spoke Arabic. He was exposed to Persian prose and poetry, and included major Persian poets in his court, such as Ferdowsi. Biruni was captured by Mahmud's forces after the fall of Gurganj, and was held as a hostage. Ibn Sina escaped Mahmud's clutches by fleeing from Gurganj. However, Mahmud and his son Masood would later pose threats to Ibn Sina. 9. Ibn Sina, Encyclopedist. The chapter, Ibn Sina, Encyclopedist, details Ibn Sina's transition from a court physician and philosopher to an encyclopedist, focusing on his time in Gorgan, his motivations for writing the canon of medicine, and the intellectual context in which he worked. After the death of Qabus, Gorgan lacked a royal court, but Ibn Sina secured a position in financial administration, and the local intelligentsia welcomed him. Ibn Sina spent 3 years in Gorgan, where he found a new direction and worked productively, supported by Abu Muhammad as-Shirazi. Shirazi provided Ibn Sina with a house next to his own and, in exchange, Ibn Sina tutored him on various subjects and prepared treatises and books on topics of interest to Shirazi. These projects did not reflect Ibn Sina's own interests, but he had no other options. Shirazi commissioned Ibn Sina to help him understand geometry and astronomy. Ibn Sina had studied Euclid's Elements and Ptolemy's Almagest, but, because Shirazi was not interested in extensive reading, Ibn Sina created abridgments or digests. Ibn Sina produced a summary of the Almagest, a shorter summary of logic, and a collection of universal observations for Shirazi. He later incorporated passages from these works into his major philosophical works. During this time, Ibn Sina realized that he needed to create a complete and logically structured overview of knowledge to ensure that his ideas would outlive him. The idea of bringing together all that has been learned in a given field of knowledge dates back to the Greeks. Aristotle declared his intention to analyze all knowledge, and Ptolemy, Euclid, and Galen embraced this aspiration. Some ancient encyclopedists became mere collectors of facts, like Pliny the Elder, who amassed 20,000 facts from 2,000 works by 200 authors. The most renowned writers of antiquity sought not only to master the facts, but also to explain how they related to each other. When readers in the Middle East and Central Asia gained access to translated works of Greek encyclopedists, they followed the same impulse. The 9th-century encyclopedist Ibn Qutayba sought to collect and organize all knowledge. Encyclopedic collections covering plants, animals, astrology, and customs soon emerged. A single collection of poems and songs ran to 10,000 pages. Muhammad bin Yusuf al-Khwarazmi, a fellow Bukharan, produced an encyclopedic keys to the sciences, which condensed the best of ancient and modern learning. Even compilations of the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad reflected the urge for encyclopedic knowledge that accompanied the penetration of ancient Greek learning into the Muslim world. By the era of Ibn Sina, Encyclopedists followed a three-part format: a presentation of what the ancients had to say on a given subject, the identification of problems or errors in the ancient texts, the compiler's suggestions on how to address those difficulties. Ibn Sina gravitated to this format, and many of his early writings can be viewed as small-scale proto-encyclopedias. Ibn Sina decided to write an encyclopedia of medicine based on his own logical structure, due to his situation in Gorgan without a royal patron and with limited scientific interests from his patron. He may have considered similar works on metaphysics and logic, but those would have to wait. Ibn Sina was aware of the vast array of classical works on medicine. Aristotle included passages on medicine in his books. Galen had spelled out Hippocrates' theory of the four humours, stressed the links between medicine, logic, and philosophy, and even written a book entitled That the Best Physician is Also a Philosopher. Hunayn ibn Ishaq had translated numerous works by Galen into Arabic, and also written his own introduction to medicine. Dioscorides wrote a 5-volume work on pharmacology that Ibn Sina's tutor, Abu Abdullah al-Natili, had edited. Ibn Sina faced further challenges from more recent medical texts. Razi's comprehensive book of medicine was poorly organized and confusing. Ali ibn al-Abbas al-Majusi, a student of Razi, had published his own complete book of the medical art, which was more concise and practical. Despite these challenges, Ibn Sina had good reasons to proceed with his own medical encyclopedia. Galen's works were unwieldy. Tabari's lacked depth. Razi's was too disorganized. Majusi's was thin on the philosophical side. Ibn Sina chose the title Canon of Medicine, canon, to signify it was nothing less than the law of medicine. He began writing the Canon of Medicine at the age of 40, while in Gorgan with limited resources and prospects. Ibn Sina gathered, organized, corrected with his own clinical experience, and enriched the laws of medicine with his insights on the interaction of body and soul. The Canon of Medicine became the single most influential medical work in the world for half a millennium, numbering some 2,500 pages in modern translations. 10. Expanding the Known World. The chapter, Expanding the Known World, details Biruni's experiences after the collapse of Khwarazm, focusing on his time in captivity at Nandana and the scientific work he undertook there. It also highlights his development of geodesy as a field of study. In 1017, Biruni's world collapsed after the fall of the Ibn Iraq dynasty. The ruler of Khwarazm, who was Biruni's patron, was murdered and the capital was ransacked. Biruni was taken captive by Mahmud's army and faced a long and arduous trek to central Afghanistan. Many of those with whom Biruni had lived and worked were either killed or taken captive during the fighting. Biruni was spared execution and instead sent to a remote fortress called Nandana, high in the Salt Range in present-day Pakistan. The valley it commanded was strategically important and had been used by Alexander the Great as a route to India. Mahmud had recently captured Nandana, but used it only to incarcerate criminals. Biruni was deeply depressed due to his failure as a diplomat and his perceived responsibility for his ruler's death. The fighting in Gurganj had destroyed his library and all of his scientific instruments. He compared his distress to that of the prophets Noah and Lot. Despite his depression, Biruni managed to improvise a simple instrument called a counting board near Kabul and used it to fix the coordinates of that spot on September 15, 1018. While at Nandana, Biruni carried out his most precise measurement of the earth before modern times. He never spoke of his presence at Nandana, except for one brief mention. By late 1018, Biruni was able to focus on his work while complying with Mahmud's demands and keeping the Sultan and his court at arm's length. He began work on his study, the determination of the coordinates of positions for the correction of distances between cities, completing it in 1025. This work is the foundation for modern geodesy. The Russian translator of this book chose to rename it geodesy. Geodesy is the discipline that measures the Earth's geometric shape and orientation in space. Biruni used astronomy to measure distances on the Earth's curved surface. He sought to determine the Earth's precise dimensions and to create a process for measuring all terrestrial distances, including latitude and longitude. He considered geodesy the master science of Earth studies, built on astronomy, mathematics, geometry, geography, and cartography. Its origins trace to Aristotle, Euclid, and Ptolemy, though the ancients did little more than provide a starting point. Biruni's basic philosophy was based on careful measurement and mathematics. He believed that all that exists is denumerable, beginning with the number 1 and ending in a finite number. He attacked Aristotle and his own adversary, Ibn Sina, for using syllogisms to understand core issues. Biruni's work also explored the impact of astronomical conditions on the geology of mountains, lakes, deserts, and tides. He explained how the sun's rays decrease in intensity from the equator to the poles. Biruni is revealed as an evolutionist, believing that the world underwent profound changes after God created it, such as the upsurge of mountains and the drying up of seas. Biruni's writing style in his geodesy work is not graceful, and his presentations are difficult to follow. He seemed to be using the written word to record his own reasoning process rather than to communicate broadly. In the determination of the coordinates of cities, Biruni focused on human societies and economies and their diverse characters in different parts of the world, using astronomy and mathematics to support this end. He appreciated how geography and climate, shaped by astronomical realities, mold human development. Biruni aimed to enlarge our understanding of the Earth itself. He considered Aristotle's concept of a single-world island surrounded by a great ocean as dubious. He also did not consider Ptolemy's Almagest to be the final word on geography. Biruni relied mainly on his own research, drawing on earlier studies and information from merchants. Biruni's contribution to the world of exploration was significant. He measured the Earth with great precision. He knew of Bouzjani's suggestion of determining the Earth's radius by a two-step triangulation process involving measuring angles from a mountaintop. He used this method at Nandana to measure the Earth's diameter, which differs from the modern calculation by only 62 kilometers. His calculation of the Earth's circumference is only 0.007% less than the modern figure. He also measured 1 degree of longitude at the equator, which is only 0.085% less than the modern figure. His measurements opened the way for more precise calculations of longitudes, continent sizes, and distances. His was the single most momentous act of discovery in the fields of geography and geodesy up to that time. Biruni wrote corrections to the Elements by Al-Farghani, though this book is lost. Abu al-Abbas Farghani was a 9th-century astronomer who made efforts to measure the Earth's diameter and summarized the astronomy and geography of Ptolemy's Almagest. Biruni respected Farghani, but he also discovered errors in Farghani's work and wrote a 400-page tome to correct them. Biruni's achievements in astronomy were significant, but have only recently been closely studied. His work largely supplanted Ptolemy's Almagest and set the field onto a new course. He corrected his predecessor's work rather than replacing it, reflecting his methodical approach to science. Biruni practiced slow and deliberate science, not eureka moments. 11. Ibn Sina's Adventures. The chapter, Ibn Sina's Adventures, details Ibn Sina's life after leaving Gurganj, his move to Ray, his time in Hamadan, and his escape to Isfahan. It emphasizes Ibn Sina's diverse roles as a physician, philosopher, statesman, and teacher during this period. Ibn Sina left Gurganj in 1012, a year before his patron Suhaili's departure, traveling with his medical colleague Masihi and a relative of the Shah, taking a dangerous route across the Karakum Desert, possibly to avoid being captured. Ibn Sina was fleeing because Mahmud of Ghazni demanded that the new Shah of Khwarezm send several men of learning, each peerless in his science, to his court. It is said that Mahmud commissioned Ibn Iraq, also a talented painter, to produce a portrait of Ibn Sina, a kind of most wanted poster, to be posted throughout the region. Ibn Sina intended to go to Gorgan, where Biruni's former patron Qabus was restocking his court with thinkers and poets, and where his friend, the Christian Dr. Masihi, was from. However, after Qabus' death, Gorgan no longer had a royal court, and Ibn Sina took a job as an official in financial administration. During his 3 years in Gorgan, he was supported by Abu Muhammad as-Shirazi, who commissioned him to write on various topics, including geometry and astronomy. During his time in Gorgan, Ibn Sina also wrote his treatise, The Origin and Return, and began his Encyclopedia of Medicine, the Canon of Medicine. His student, Abu Ubaid al-Juzjani, joined him in Gorgan and became his assistant, amanuensis, and chronicler. Juzjani recorded Ibn Sina's autobiography. Around 1014, Ibn Sina moved to Ray. He was sought out to cure the young emir Mad al-Dawla, who was ill, and was subsequently appointed court physician. While in Ray, he worked on the first volume of the Canon of Medicine and composed treatises on the soul, called The State of the Human Soul or The Destination, which explored the soul's fate after death. After failing to find a post in Qazvin, Ibn Sina went to Hamadan, where the lady, Mad al-Dawla's mother, welcomed him and offered him the job of managing her personal finances. Ibn Sina served as a vizier in Hamadan. In Hamadan, Ibn Sina pursued 4 different careers: practitioner and theoretician of medicine, philosopher of science and cosmology, senior governmental official, and teacher of advanced students. As vizier, Ibn Sina wrote official documents and a study on public administration, though they are now lost. He held public audiences and gathered students for evening sessions to read and discuss his work. Ibn Sina's evening sessions in Hamadan were known for their drinking and entertainment, which included professional singers, and were criticized by some, including his assistant Juzjani. Ibn Sina's time in Hamadan was interrupted by his incarceration at the Fardakan castle. While imprisoned, he wrote several pieces, including an epistle on colitis, which was added to the canon, the Guidance, a pedagogical allegory for his brother, and the allegory Alive, Son of Awake. He also developed the thought experiment of the floating man, which explored the immateriality of the human soul. After his release from Fardakan, Ibn Sina fled Hamadan to Isfahan. He disguised himself as a Sufi pilgrim along with his brother Mahmud, his assistant Juzjani, and 2 slaves. Ibn Sina was treated as a celebrity in Isfahan, where he was seated next to the emir, Ala al-Dawla, at official events. Despite his elevated status, Ibn Sina was known to be hypersensitive and sought revenge on those who offended him. In Isfahan, Ibn Sina was made vizier. He wrote a concise 1-volume encyclopedia in Persian, The Salvation, Najat. He continued work on the cure and finished the Canon of Medicine. 12. Biruni's masterpiece. The chapter Biruni's Masterpiece focuses on Biruni's book India, its significance, and the methods he used to study Indian culture. It also emphasizes his analytical approach, his appreciation of Indian achievements, and his efforts to understand Hinduism on its own terms. Biruni's India is considered one of the most significant works in the development of the social sciences globally. It is a voluminous book, with modern editions running to about 700 pages. The book is notable for its readability. It contributes to diverse fields, including mathematics, astronomy, cultural anthropology, geography, geology, and the comparative study of religions. Despite its importance, India remains largely unacknowledged except by a few specialists. By the time Biruni returned to Ghazni, he had access to a comprehensive library on India and could consult with Indian scholars, captive intellectuals, and translators. These individuals were as important as written sources in shaping his understanding of Indian civilization. Biruni's purpose in writing India was not to create a mere travel guide. He was aware that other writers had described parts of India, but their work was superficial and biased. Biruni's goal was to answer specific questions about Indian mathematics and astronomy. His project was analytical, not descriptive, and not an exercise in cultural judgment. Biruni recognized that Indians were advanced in some areas of mathematics and astronomy. He considered himself a student of Indian scholars when he first arrived in India. Indian scholars came to appreciate Biruni's analyses of their work, and even sought his views on astronomy. Biruni did note flaws in their analyses, usually in their mathematics. Biruni critiqued the work of the Indian mathematician and astronomer Brahmagupta, whose work had inspired him in his youth. Brahmagupta's contributions included the concept of zero, the decimal system, negative numbers, sine tables, and a precise calculation of pi. Biruni scrutinized and corrected Brahmagupta's measurements of distances to the moon and the radii of the moon and earth. Biruni translated one of the works of the Indian polymath Varahamihira, but found his reasoning sloppy and his mathematics worse. He was also critical of another commentator named Balabhodra. Biruni considered the astronomer Aryabhatta and his followers to be men of great scientific achievement. Biruni analyzed astronomical assumptions found in Hindu religious literature such as the Puranas, including the concept of the egg of Brahman. He concluded that the differences in traditions from these sources could not be rationally accounted for. Biruni explored Indian concepts of time, expanding on his previous research in his chronologies. He saw research as an ongoing process driven by new evidence. Biruni methodically recorded geographical data, listing cities with their latitudes and longitudes, and noting the direction of roads and rivers. He only provided precise data on lengths that he himself had confirmed. Biruni was critical of some aspects of Indian science, tracing flaws to Hinduism itself, while also congratulating Indian thinkers for their knowledge of the laws of nature. Biruni provided a detailed analysis of Hindu beliefs, both as explained by Brahmins and as understood by the common people. He stated he would present the theories of Hindus exactly as they were. He examined the Hindu concepts of gods, noting their ideas on the subject were not well developed. He translated passages from Patanjali's Yoga Sutras from Sanskrit to Arabic and offered his own commentary, comparing it with Muslim Sufis and Christian mystics. Biruni compared and contrasted Hinduism with Islam, focusing on differences such as the concept of metempsychosis. He noted that the Brahmin caste was the bearer of Hinduism's intellectual heritage. He examined Hindu rituals and customs in detail and explained their origins. He argued that religious sculptures and images originated from the human desire to commemorate the dead and console the living.